The doctors walked away. The boy waited to die. Then the maid reached under his pillow and found something terrifying. For 3 years, Caleb Rutherford had emptied half of Manhattan's best hospitals trying to save his son. New York Presbyterian, specialists from Columbia, private consultants flown in from Johns Hopkins. Every scan said the same thing. Every test ended the same way. There's nothing more we can do. So the machines were removed. The treatments were reduced. And the word terminal was finally spoken out loud. Elliot Rutherford, once a loud, unstoppable little boy, now lay in silence inside the massive Greenwich estate, wrapped in a green hoodie far too big for his thin body, clutching a worn teddy bear as if it were the last thing anchoring him to life. The house no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like a waiting room for death. Caleb moved through the halls like a ghost in a suit, answering calls, signing documents, pretending his heart wasn't collapsing hour by hour. And everyone accepted what the doctors said. Everyone except the maid. Maribel Knox rode 2 buses and a late-night train from Newark, New Jersey every day to clean a house that no longer felt alive. She was not trained in medicine. She had no white coat. She had no credentials. But she had eyes. And she had conviction. While the doctors saw charts, Maribel saw fear. While nurses counted hours, Maribel counted breaths. And on this night, as thunder rolled across the quiet streets of Greenwich, and Elliot trembled in soft, secret sobs, she noticed something the doctors in New York never questioned. Something hidden where no one else ever looked. Something that made her heart stop. And when she reached for the scissors beside his pillow, she would uncover a truth that would shatter medicine, expose power, and force a billionaire to finally believe again. What did Maribel find beneath that pillow that the doctors never thought to search? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The Rutherford estate had always exuded power, an architectural fortress built not just to protect wealth, but to project it. Everything within its walls reflected control, synchronized schedules, polished surfaces, and the unspoken confidence of a family untouched by chaos. But by winter's end, the estate had fallen silent, not from peace, but from quiet surrender. Elliot's laughter, once a bright echo bouncing off the marble halls, had faded into memory. Now the boy lay in the upstairs suite, fragile, still, and increasingly distant. The top doctors from Manhattan had come and gone. Their briefcases had arrived filled with ambition. They left carrying only regrets. In the formal library, 3 specialists stood before Caleb Rutherford, the billionaire who had built empires and buried competitors. But no amount of leverage or legacy could fight what was happening to his son. Dr. Langston spoke with precision, but even that couldn't soften the final verdict. There's nothing more we can do, Mr. Rutherford. We've exhausted every treatment. At this stage, it's about comfort. Caleb didn't respond. He only glanced at the stack of reports, then gave a faint nod. His voice was low. Understood. Then he walked out, his footsteps heavy but controlled, like a man retreating from a war he couldn't win. That same day, the nurses transitioned from urgent treatment to quiet caretaking, for bags were simplified. Monitors were silenced. The once busy guest suite became still, not peaceful, but resigned. Downstairs, the staff spoke in whispers. The grand piano remained closed. The clink of silverware at dinner had been replaced by muted clinks of coffee spoons and untouched teacups. Even the light felt dimmer, as if the mansion itself had entered mourning. Only one voice defied the silence. Maribel. She moved through Elliot's room with quiet determination, straightening his blankets, brushing crumbs from the nightstand, humming lullabies under her breath. While others avoided eye contact with the boy, Maribel sat beside him every morning and greeted him as if the world still spun forward. "Good morning, Carino," she'd whisper, fluffing his pillow. "Did you dream of the dolphins again?" Elliot's lips would twitch upward, just barely. The house had given up, but Maribel hadn't, and even as she watched the light leave his eyes inch by inch, she refused to stop speaking life into the air around him. Her stories, her prayers, her soft humming, they weren't habits. They were resistance. That night, while the rest of the staff turned in and Caleb poured another drink in the study, Maribel remained by Elliot's bedside. The fire crackled softly. Snow tapped at the window panes. Elliot stirred. "Maribel," he whispered. "I'm here, sweetheart." His voice was thin, threadbare. "Don't let me sleep tonight." She leaned closer. "You need to rest, mi niño. You'll feel better after." He shook his head slowly. "No, that's when they come." She blinked. "Who comes?" His eyes darted toward the dark corner of the room. "The ones that whisper. They wait for me. When I close my eyes." Maribel felt a chill crawl up her spine. "It's just dreams, baby. You're safe." But Elliot's hand gripped hers tightly, desperate. "They said if I sleep again, I won't wake up." Maribel glanced toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to walk in and make sense of this moment. But there was only silence. Only her, and a boy terrified not of dying, but of what waited between this world and the next. The house had surrendered, but heaven had not. Elliot begs Maribel not to let him sleep, terrified of the ones that whisper, and convinced that sleeping means never waking up again. The nights were always the worst. By day, the estate moved in slow, muted rhythms, footsteps in slippers, curtains half drawn, voices barely above whispers. But after midnight, something in the Rutherford mansion shifted. The stillness wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. Maribel didn't sleep much anymore. She stayed in the staff wing just down the hall from Elliot's room and would often find excuses to check on him. An extra blanket, a misplaced glass of water, a lullaby she claimed to have forgotten earlier. One night, around 2 a.m., she tiptoed into his room and turned on the bedside lamp. Elliot stirred slightly, his eyes already open. "You're awake," she whispered. He nodded. His voice was barely audible. "He comes after midnight." Maribel frowned. "Who does?" But Elliot's eyes shifted toward the window. Not outside, just past it, like he was watching something move behind the air. She didn't press. Not yet. The next morning, while fluffing his pillows, Maribel noticed something strange. A faint chemical smell clung to the fabric. Not the fresh linen scent she recognized from the laundry room, but something sharp, synthetic, almost like a lab. She brought the pillowcase to her nose. The scent was strongest in the center, right where his head would rest. And it was new. She had changed the bedding herself the day before. Later, as she helped Elliot dress, she gently rolled up his pajama sleeve and paused. Tiny puncture marks, 4 of them, not a line, but scattered across his upper arm. Small, round, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. She hadn't seen them yesterday. Her chest tightened. "Did one of the nurses give you shots last night?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, only when the sun is out." "And this?" She pointed to the marks. Elliot glanced at them, then looked away. "He doesn't speak. He just does it." "Who, mi amor?" But he wouldn't say. He just pulled his sleeve down and looked away. Maribel waited until after lunch, then went down to the private medicine cabinet the doctors had set up in the hallway. Every dose was logged, time, nurse, quantity. The logbook was perfect. Too perfect. That night, she paid closer attention during the evening medication routine. Nurse Alina drew Elliot's sleep dose from a bottle labeled Night Suspension, 3 milligrams. The liquid was a pale amber. Maribel memorized the shade, like weak tea. But the next night, when she peeked over another nurse's shoulder, the same label poured out a cloudy pink. "Is that the same medicine?" she asked casually. "Yes," the nurse replied. "Just a different batch." Maribel said nothing, but her stomach turned. She made 2 quiet phone calls. First to the Manhattan specialists. They brushed off her concern. Color variance is normal. Different labs, different excipients. Perfectly safe. Then to her cousin in the city, a nurse who worked oncology. "Color changes?" her cousin repeated. "Not unless the formulation changes, and that should be documented." But there was nothing in the log. The chemical scent, the fresh marks, the medicine that shifted without warning, the boy who whispered about midnight visits. None of it added up. Still, no alarms were raised. No one questioned the routines, because the staff, even the doctors, had accepted the inevitable. But Maribel hadn't. Grace doesn't shout, it whispers. So the next night, she hid behind the door in Elliot's room. The lamp dimmed. Her breath held. And just past midnight, she heard footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not the housekeeper. Not Caleb. Not anyone scheduled. They stopped right outside the boy's door. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. Who was entering Elliot's room without permission? The marble floors in the Manhattan Hospital Administration wing gleamed like mirrors, as if reflection could somehow equal transparency. But Maribel wasn't fooled. She sat across from a senior administrator, a woman in a dark blazer who smiled too often and blinked too little. Between them sat a thin file containing notes Maribel hadn't written and explanations she hadn't requested. "I understand your concern," the administrator said smoothly. "But sometimes, when a caregiver becomes emotionally attached, it's easy to see patterns that aren't there." Maribel's voice remained calm. "There are injection marks on his arms. His medicine changes color. He says someone comes at night." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Yes, you're under a lot of pressure, Miss Santiago. It's not uncommon to project fears onto routine medical activity. We've reviewed all logs. Everything is accounted for. And the cameras?" A pause. "What about them?" "I asked for footage from Elliot's room wing. I was told it's restricted." "That's correct. To protect patient privacy. I had access before. Now you don't." That was the end of it. When she left the office, a younger nurse followed her to the elevator and leaned in. "Just be careful, Maribel. You ask too many questions. They'll remind you where you stand." Back at the estate, Caleb was already home, a glass of scotch in hand, a storm in his eyes. "They called me today," he muttered. "Told me you're accusing the staff of tampering with Elliot's meds." "I'm not accusing. I'm observing." He slammed the glass down. "You're not a doctor. You're a maid." Her voice didn't rise. "I'm the only one who sees him past the reports." He looked at her, long and hard, and something in his face cracked for a moment. Not anger. Something worse. Fear. "I can't go through this again," he said, softer now. "They told me it's grief. that I'm imagining things because I'm losing him. I don't know what's real anymore. That night, the medication schedule was changed without warning. A printed document, unsigned, appeared on the nurse's station. New times, new dosages, no questions allowed. When Maribel asked, she was told the Manhattan team had approved it, but no one could produce the approval. She checked on Elliot at midnight. He was awake, eyes wide open, face pale. "They're closer now," he whispered. "Who, mi amor?" "They're inside the walls." She stroked his hair, trying to soothe him, but his body was rigid with tension. He stared at the air like it might rip open. "I saw one," he whispered, "in the mirror, but he wasn't me." Maribel's hand trembled. "Did you tell your papa?" "He doesn't believe in monsters anymore." Neither did Maribel, but something didn't feel right. Not in the medicine, not in the silence, not in the way her questions were being buried. She went downstairs, trying to call the hospital again, but her access number had been deactivated. Everything around her felt like it was closing in, not with noise, but with polite redirection, with cold smiles, with doors that used to open now staying shut. She thought of Elliot's eyes, the way they darted around the room like he was tracking shadows, and for a moment the doubt crept in. Was she starting to unravel? Had grief and sleepless nights started to twist her mind? Or was something truly wrong? He feared believing again, because hope can hurt. She returned to Elliot's room, sat quietly at his side, and held his hand. His fingers gripped hers like he was holding on to more than just comfort. And still, deep in the quiet of the night, she found herself asking the one question she never thought would cross her mind. Was I imagining all of this? Thunder cracked across the night sky, shaking the glass of the Rutherford estate. Rain hammered the windows in waves, matching the erratic rise and fall of Elliot's breathing. He was curled into himself on the edge of the bed, knees to his chest, shivering beneath his green hoodie, the one he refused to take off, even when fever made him sweat through it. Tears slid down his cheeks, silent but endless. Maribel sat beside him, rubbing his back in slow circles, but it didn't soothe him tonight. He flinched at every thunderclap, every shadow on the wall. Downstairs, Caleb's voice rose above the storm. "No, I don't care if the hospital director is sleeping. You tell him to call me now." The call ended with a clatter, glass shattering against stone. Maribel turned back to Elliot. She reached for his pillow to adjust it, then paused. Her fingers brushed against something, not soft but firm. Unnatural. She narrowed her eyes. The seam on the pillowcase was uneven, sloppy, not like the luxury linen the staff ironed and folded daily. She flipped the pillow and traced the stitching. It was subtle, but not factory done. Someone had sewn it shut. Recently. Her heart skipped. She stood, crossed the room, and opened the drawer where she kept basic supplies. A small pair of scissors gleamed in the lamplight. Elliot watched her with wide eyes. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she whispered. She returned to the bed, slid her hand beneath the pillow, and began to cut, stitch by stitch, carefully, quietly. When the final thread gave way, she pulled back the fabric and froze. A thin, flat object dropped into her palm. It was no bigger than a postage stamp, clear, adhesive, with an iridescent film barely visible in the low light. A micropatch. She held it up to the lamp. Fine circuitry lined the edges. A soft chemical scent rose from it. It wasn't a fever strip. It wasn't a cooling patch. It was medical and illegal. Her hands trembling, she pulled out her phone, snapped a photo, and sent it to her cousin, the nurse in Manhattan. Within seconds, the phone buzzed back. "Where did you find this?" "In Elliot's pillow," she typed. The response came almost instantly. "That's not for children. That's a neurological suppressant. Rare, black label. Only used in severe adult trauma cases, and never without consent." Another message. "It mimics late-stage brain failure. That kid would show every symptom of terminal decline while actually being drugged." Maribel's throat went dry. She looked at Elliot, his shaking hands, his vacant stare, the nights of terror, the whispers, the confusion. He wasn't dying. He was being made to look like he was. This was no accident. This was design. She stood slowly, unable to tear her eyes from the patch in her hand. A drug meant to mimic death, planted in a child's pillow. She heard Caleb's voice downstairs again, louder now, panicked. He didn't know. She was sure of it. But someone did. Someone who had access. Someone who had a reason. Lightning flashed outside the window, lighting the room in white for a split second. In that moment, Maribel looked around Elliot's room. The bed, the door, the silent machines. Her hand closed tightly around the patch. Who had planted it? The rain hadn't stopped. Thunder rolled low above the Greenwich Hills as Maribel stood in the doorway of Caleb Rutherford's private study, the one room in the estate when no one entered uninvited. But tonight, she didn't wait for permission. She stepped inside. Caleb looked up from his desk. The lamp cast long shadows across his face, making him look older. Not in years, but in exhaustion. His phone was still in his hand. He'd been calling hospitals, labs, and administrators all night. "I need to show you something," Maribel said. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her as she walked forward. She placed a micropatch on the desk, next to a half-empty glass. "I found this sewn into Elliot's pillow." He leaned in slowly. The moment his fingers brushed the patch, his entire posture changed. "What is it?" Maribel's voice trembled. "A suppressant. My cousin works in trauma response. She says it mimics neurological failure. Exactly what Elliot's been showing." Caleb stared at the patch like it might detonate. Then he picked up his phone, dialed fast, and barked out names, doctors, directors, specialists. Each response was the same. "We don't use that. We don't know how it got there. We're sorry." One call ended with silence, another with defensiveness, a third with denial. By the fifth, Caleb slammed the phone against the desk. "Someone did this to my son," he said. "This wasn't nature. This wasn't fate. Someone engineered it." He stood, paced the room like a man losing ground inside his own home. The storm outside couldn't compete with the one rising in his chest. Maribel stayed still. "This whole time," he whispered, "they told me it was grief, paranoia, my imagination, and I believed them." He stopped pacing. Then something inside him cracked. He sat down, then dropped lower, sinking to his knees on the cold hardwood floor. He didn't speak for a long time. His hands shook as they covered his face. The billionaire who once dined with kings, who commanded boardrooms and dictated futures, now curled forward in silence. Maribel didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply waited. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a breath, Caleb said, "If there's anything listening, I don't care about my money. I don't care about my name. I just want my son back." And for the first time he prayed. No ceremony, no folded hands, no practiced words, just raw surrender. The storm outside surged, wind screaming against the glass. "I found this sewn into Elliot's pillow." He leaned in slowly. The moment his fingers brushed the patch, his entire posture changed. "What is it?" Maribel's voice trembled. "A suppressant. My cousin works in trauma response. She says it mimics neurological failure. Exactly what Elliot's been showing." Caleb stared at the patch like it might detonate. Then he picked up his phone, dialed fast, and barked out names: doctors, directors, specialists. Each response was the same: "We don't use that. We don't know how it got there. We're sorry." One call ended with silence, another with defensiveness, a third with denial. By the fifth, Caleb slammed the phone against the desk. "Someone did this to my son," he said. "This wasn't nature. This wasn't fate. Someone engineered it." He stood, paced the room like a man losing ground inside his own home. The storm outside couldn't compete with the one rising in his chest. Maribel stayed still. "This whole time," he whispered, "they told me it was grief, paranoia, my imagination, and I believed them." He stopped pacing. Then something inside him cracked. He sat down, then dropped lower, sinking to his knees on the cold hardwood floor. He didn't speak for a long time. His hands shook as they covered his face. The billionaire who once dined with kings, who commanded boardrooms and dictated futures, now curled forward in silence. Maribel didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply waited. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a breath, Caleb said, "If there's anything listening, I don't care about my money. I don't care about my name. I just want my son back." And for the first time he prayed. No ceremony, no folded hands, no practiced words, just raw surrender. The storm outside surged, wind screaming against the glass. But inside the study, for the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was reverent. Maribel stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Caleb's shoulder. "They won't admit what they've done," she said, "and they won't listen to someone like me." He looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Then we make them listen." She hesitated. "Even if they turn this on us." He stood, slower this time, his voice steadier. "Then we give them no choice." He picked up the patch, stared at it a moment longer, then locked it in the safe behind his bookshelf. Outside, thunder rumbled like the groan of something ancient. Inside, a father and a maid stood in a study once ruled by certainty, now haunted by truth. Would anyone believe the maid? The lab in Manhattan didn't look like much from the outside. Just another third-floor walk-up with frosted windows and a flickering hallway light. But inside, it held what no one else had offered: neutrality. Caleb had pulled strings to get the test fast-tracked. A sample from Elliot's blood, the patch, and a bottle of his so-called night suspension. The toxicologist, a man with tired eyes and steady hands, took one look at the patch and narrowed his gaze. "This isn't just unethical," he said after 2 hours in the lab. "It's criminal." He ran the blood work twice. Same result. Traces of a suppressant not approved for pediatric use. The same compound laced in the patch. The same compound matched to one of the medications Elliot had been taking nightly. Caleb stood at the window, staring down at the traffic. Maribel sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You were right," the text said. "Whoever administered this wasn't just trying to treat symptoms. They were simulating a terminal decline. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it." They left with the report in hand. By the time they reached the Connecticut State Police headquarters, storm clouds were forming again. Detectives reviewed the results. They questioned the hospital logs, cross-referenced names. It didn't take long before the cracks began to show. Timestamps had been edited, dosage logs rewritten, surveillance footage from Elliot's wing mysteriously corrupted between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. on 3 different nights. Maribel sat across from a plainclothes officer and listed every person who had worked the night shift. She spoke slowly, clearly, even as her throat tightened. "I watched one nurse give him a dose I didn't recognize," she said. "It didn't come from a usual tray." "And the nurse's name?" "Rena McKay. She only worked nights. Always left before the morning doctors came in." The detective frowned. "There's no nurse by that name in the hospital's personnel records." Maribel blinked. "I saw her. I spoke to her." The detective stood, murmured something to a colleague, and disappeared into the hall. 20 minutes later, he returned. His face was pale. "Not only does she not exist in the system, she's gone. The ID she used was stolen from a retired nurse who died 6 months ago." Maribel sat back, the weight of it all pressing into her spine. Someone had planned this with precision, and someone didn't want it traced. The next day, the official toxicology report was delivered to both the police and the hospital board. There was no more denying it. Elliot Rutherford had been chemically suppressed. His decline was not natural. It was engineered. Word spread quickly through quiet hallways and guarded conversations. The night staff were pulled in for questioning. Some denied involvement. Others stayed silent. And one nurse didn't show up at all. Disappeared. No trace. Security teams scoured the staff entrance footage. Nothing. It was as if she'd never existed. Inside the estate, Maribel returned to Elliot's room, the boy still trembling beneath layers of blankets. She sat beside him again, brushing a hand across his damp forehead. His breathing was weaker now, slower, but he was still here, still fighting. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she didn't fully understand. A quiet presence filled the room, like heaven paused to watch. Outside, the wind moved gently against the glass, no longer violent, but waiting. And for the first time, Maribel wondered, was it already too late for Elliot? The ride to Manhattan was silent. Elliot lay unconscious in the back of the ambulance, an oxygen mask covering his pale face. Caleb sat beside him, one hand gripping the gurney rail like it anchored his entire world. Maribel sat across from them, her fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. But in her chest, a single hope had begun to stir, small, stubborn, and impossible to silence. Within minutes of arriving at New York Presbyterian, the medical team moved fast. An independent pediatric neurologist led the charge, bypassing every previous directive. Orders were clear: remove everything. Every drug, every patch, every assumption. Fluids were flushed, for bags replaced, and the moment the suppressant compound left his bloodstream, Elliot's monitors began to change. Slowly, then rapidly, brain activity climbed. Heart rate stabilized. By the 4th hour, the boy who'd once seemed too far gone stirred under the sheets. Caleb stood frozen beside the bed, watching as his son blinked up at the white ceiling. Then Elliot spoke. "Dad." The voice was hoarse, but it was his. Caleb dropped to the floor, not out of shock, but out of overwhelming gratitude. His body folded, his hands covering his mouth as he let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob or a prayer, but something in between. "Dad, I'm hungry," Elliot said. Maribel covered her mouth, the tears rushing before she could stop them. 2 nurses exchanged looks. A third walked briskly out of the room. Moments later, doctors from the toxicology board arrived, followed by security officers. One by one, names were handed over. Records, footage, evidence. Arrests were made within the hour. The woman calling herself Rena McKay was tracked to a rented condo in Queens. She didn't speak a word as she was taken away in cuffs. Another technician fled but was intercepted at JFK trying to leave the country. Others, those who'd stayed silent, were charged as accomplices. Inside the ICU, none of that noise reached Elliot's room, because in that small, sterile space, something sacred was happening. The boy who'd been labeled terminal had returned. He looked stronger with each passing minute. He smiled for the first time in weeks. His fingers, once cold and limp, now clutched Maribel's hand like he knew she had never let go. She leaned in, unable to hold back the flood anymore. Tears rolled down her face in waves, and for once, they weren't from fear. They were from relief, from awe, from witnessing the impossible. Caleb knelt beside his son's bed, brushing a hand through the boy's hair. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. Elliot blinked slowly, tired but present. "You found me," he said. Caleb turned his face away, overcome again. Maribel stood back, watching father and son. She had no words, only breath, only thanks. This wasn't science. This wasn't chance. This was grace. In the hallway beyond the glass, nurses and staff paused as word spread. A boy misdiagnosed. A case corrupted. But a life saved. Inside, the beeping of the monitors now felt like music. Hope no longer whispered. It rang. And as Maribel looked at the child she had once been told to give up on, she felt something shift. In the room, in the air, in herself. A miracle had unfolded in front of them. But even miracles come with a shadow. Because in the quiet moments after the tears had slowed, one question still remained in the back of her mind. Who wanted him gone and why? The truth came out in waves. Headlines erupted across every major outlet. Medical manipulation exposed in pediatric near murder. Unlicensed drug ring infiltrated East Coast hospitals. Billionaire's son was target of suppression scheme. But behind the cameras and breaking news, the courtroom in Manhattan was still. Maribel sat beside Caleb in the front row, both of them listening as the judge read aloud the final ruling. Deliberate falsification of medical records, criminal negligence, conspiracy to commit medical fraud. The list went on. One by one, names were named. People in white coats, trusted for years, were stripped of everything. Titles, licenses, reputations. One defendant wept. Another stared blankly. A third looked directly at Maribel, as if trying to memorize her face. She didn't flinch. Because the real victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the boy who waited safely at home. Elliot. When the gavel finally fell, it was over. But for Caleb, it was only the beginning. By the following month, the Rutherford Accountability Foundation was launched, an independent organization committed to tracking hospital corruption, anonymous whistleblower protection, and patient advocacy. Caleb personally funded its first 3 years and requested only one person to help lead its public mission. Maribel. She declined the title, but accepted the trust, because her role had already changed. Not long after the case closed, Caleb, in a press conference watched by millions, announced that Maribel Santiago was now Elliot's full-time legal guardian and protector. His voice cracked when he said it. She was the only one who stayed when everyone else gave up. He told the world. She's not just our maid. She's family. Back in Greenwich, the mansion awakened again. The piano keys were played. The staff smiled again. The gardens bloomed without restraint. And Elliot went back to school. On his first day, he wore the same green hoodie. Not out of fear this time, but remembrance. He walked through the front gates with Maribel at his side and turned once to wave at his father, who stood proudly at the car. That afternoon, laughter echoed down the halls of the Rutherford estate. Real laughter. Loud, unapologetic, alive. And though the storm had passed, its memory lived on. Not in fear, but in fire. A fire to protect what matters. To speak when silence is easier. To see the invisible things others choose to overlook. Maribel often sat in the sunroom, watching Elliot draw, or read, or smile. Sometimes, he'd catch her staring and raise an eyebrow. "What?" he'd ask. She'd shake her head. "Nothing, mi amor. Just everything." The scars were still there, on his arms, in her mind, in Caleb's sleepless nights. But they no longer defined them. They were part of the story, not the end of it. And though the world had moved on to its next scandal, its next headline, the Rutherford family never forgot who saved the boy no one else believed in. Because in the end, justice came, healing came. And though the world had moved on to its next scandal, its next headline, the Rutherford family never forgot who saved the boy no one else believed in. Because in the end, justice came, healing came, and the house that once waited for death had become a home again. Sometimes, God hides truth in the hands of those the world overlooks.